Our whole country and even people around the world were shocked and appalled a few years ago when a white supremacist gunman went into the Bible study at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and after sitting through the Bible study, opened fire and killed a significant number of the people who were there attending that Bible study for no other reason other than hatred and desire to terrorize and expel non-whites from the United States. And the world was even more astonished and was even more moved when the gunman was arraigned and was tried and was convicted of murder. And before he was sentenced, the family members of the slain were allowed to give testimony to the court that would influence the judge's sentence. And when the one after another, on camera, these family members stood up in court, addressed the judge, and addressed the guilty man, and said to him, "You have taken from me my daughter, my son, my spouse, my brother, my sister. You've taken from me something that I'm going to live with the ache of this loss for the rest of my life, but I want you to know that I forgive you." And one after the next, forgave this murderer who had no remorse whatsoever for what he had done. Around that time, I saw online an atheist who had remarked or tweeted, "What's going on in Charleston right now is quite an advertisement for Christianity." Even this atheist who didn't believe that there was a God couldn't help but be amazed at the power of Christian belief in this remnant in the Emmanuel AME Church. Similarly, a well-known journalist, Malcolm Gladwell, who has written best-selling books like The Tipping Point, Blink, Outliers. It was written for The New Yorker and other important magazines. A real thinker and public intellectual and brilliant business writer. He grew up in a Christian home in Canada. And while his siblings were very much devoted to the Christian faith, he himself never quite tapped into it. He respected it well enough, but he respected the faith of his parents, but it wasn't something that he ever personally felt. He had a certain degree of intellectual willingness to consider and be open to the claims of Christ, but it wasn't something that affected him personally. In the course of a long and illustrious career that he is still conducting, still in, at about the age of 50, as he was working on his book, David and Goliath, he interviewed an unusual couple in Saskatchewan, Canada. This is a farming couple who, in a similar story, their daughter had been killed, had been murdered, and because of their Christian faith, forgave the murderer and were known that they had done this. And when Gladwell came into their home and sat in their living room and asked them to tell their story, he wrote later that something came over him, and something was affecting him like it had never affected him before. It was not as though there was anything particularly new. He knew all the claims of Christianity backwards and forwards. He knew what was motivating this couple completely. But what struck him in a new way was the power of this belief, was the power of its truth, that this thing must be real if it could get these people to forgive in this way. And it brought Malcolm Gladwell back to Christ. Forgiveness is a powerful, powerful thing. And it's a powerful thing that all people are brought into occasions to do it because we live in a world with sinful people. We live in a world of people who do wrong, sometimes out of foolishness and not knowing any better, and sometimes out of a great deal of malice and wickedness, and a whole lot of time a combination of both. And so we're all brought into situations where we are offended, where we are wronged, where we have reason to resent someone else for what they've done to us that they shouldn't have done, or what they didn't do to us, didn't do for us, that they should have done. We're brought into these occasions where we need to forgive. And it's in this reality that Simon Peter, one of Jesus' closest and most important disciples, comes to Jesus and says, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Now, up to 7 times is a significant amount. It's a significant amount because, first of all, 7 in Jewish ways of talking was the number for completeness. We might be more likely to use the word 10, although Jews would use the word 10 to refer to completeness also. Okay? But for Simon Peter to say 7 times, do I need to forgive him 7? Should I forgive him 7 times? Is probably Peter's way of saying to Jesus, am I supposed to forgive him no matter what? Am I supposed to forgive him every time he sins against me? That's probably what Peter meant. And Jesus, as if to underscore what Peter is saying, is indicating, yeah, you are supposed to forgive him every time he needs to be forgiven. And in fact, 7 isn't enough. And he says something that in the Greek is either 77 or 70 times 7, which is 490. It could be interpreted either way, but still it means a lot. And when you think about it, I mean, to forgive somebody 7 times is quite a lot. You know, in many cases, it's long. We can quit forgiving long before we get to the number 7. You know, but Jesus says even that is not enough. Jesus is putting forward here a degree of forgiveness, an extent of extending grace that goes beyond anything that people are ordinarily capable of doing. And he gives for us a couple of reasons to forgive, a couple of reasons to extend grace to others by forgiving in this passage here. The first and most important reason that Jesus gives for why we are to forgive is to be forgiven ourselves. And this is a really important thing. In this story that he tells about a king who's looking to settle accounts with his slaves, there's a man who comes to him, we see in verse 24, who owed him 10,000 talents. Okay? Now, the talent was a unit of weight. Okay? It was a unit of weight. So it's a unit of weight of silver. So what is hard to recognize from reading this the way we use currency today is that when Jesus says a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, he was basically saying that one of these slaves owed the king $1 bajillion. Okay? That's basically what he's saying by saying 10,000 talents. It's like $1 bajillion. It's a figure that is so large. It's like there's scarcely even a number for how much this is. The amount of weight of a talent was very large. I believe it was like 60 pounds. 10,000 talents. The way that converted into money, like the way that converted into coinage, I mean, we are talking like millions, even billions of dollars. Okay? Huge, huge amount of money. In fact, it is even questionable whether there were even 10,000 talents of silver like in existence in the Roman Empire at this time. I mean, this is a vast, vast sum of money. And it makes one wonder, like, what in the world was this guy doing to rack up 10,000 talents of debt, right? I mean, what do you have to be into to lose that much money and to keep borrowing it from your master? Like, okay, I need another advance on my salary. I think this last, 300 or 400 talents of silver will do the trick, and it just keeps happening like over and over and over and over again. I mean, he is getting into debt with his master like the size of like the gross domestic product of a nation, right? This is how much this guy has gotten in debt. And this guy comes before the king. And since he was not able to pay, verse 25, duh, right? Since he's not able to pay that back, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. In other words, and this is a common thing in the ancient world, like, you haven't paid, you haven't paid, you haven't paid. So, when you get into default, in this situation, you get into personal bankruptcy, there's no going to bankruptcy court over this. In order to get the maximum amount of assets, that a person has in order to apply it to their debt, well, their ultimate asset is their own body. And so we take the person themselves, we sell them to somebody who will take them as slaves, and that's the most we can get out of them to go against this debt, and then we'll call it square, because that's really all we can get. Okay? So this guy, his wife, and his children are all about to be sold as slaves, probably to multiple different buyers. The family's going to be broken up. They're never going to see each other again. I mean, this is really, really terrible. And the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. And the servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. Canceled the debt of $1 bajillion and let him go. Just says he writes the whole thing off. He doesn't say, well, how about you work for me for free for about 30 years and then we'll call it even. I mean, nothing. I mean, he just wipes it away. It's gone. We are at zero. You owe me nothing henceforth. And now we have the second part here where there's another slave that he immediately goes out from there, finds a fellow slave who owes him money that's much, much less, and grabs and begins to choke him and say, give me back what you owe me. And because the guy can't say, he says the very same thing, be patient with me and I'll pay back everything. But the forgiven slave won't hear it, takes him, throws him into prison. The purpose of this is you throw him into prison so that then his family members will work to pull together the money somehow to pay off the debt to set the guy free. Okay? And we get here to the end of the parable that the other slaves, the other servants see what had happened. This is verse 31. They are greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. And then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. And then Jesus gives the punchline. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. In other words, unless you really forgive. Deep down, you really do it. You really forgive your brother from your heart. The first reason that we're supposed to forgive, the first motivator for us to forgive is to be forgiven. Because Jesus makes very clear, if you do not extend the grace that I have given you, if you do not extend the grace that God has given you, then God is going to withdraw that grace that he's given. And this is a scary thing, describing being turned over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. And we know that that is never. We know that that is never. That's never going to happen for this guy. And it's never going to happen for you and me if we don't receive God's grace. The point of the story is that we ourselves have contracted a debt with God that we cannot possibly repay. Human beings have contracted a debt with God that we cannot possibly repay. We have drawn on his grace for the breath in our lungs. We have drawn on his grace for our hearts pumping in our bodies. We have drawn on his grace for the air that we breathe, for the food that we eat, for the water that we drink, for the reason that we have in our minds. We draw on his grace for the houses that we live in, for the jobs that we work, for the spouses, for the children, for the parents, for the siblings, for the friends, for moments of joy and pleasure. We have drawn on his grace for all of those things. All human beings have, some more than others perhaps, but all have drawn on that grace just to even be living. And so what should be coming out of us as a result is endless praise to the one who's given us life, glory to the one who's given us life, submission to the one who's given us life, endless obedience to him, endless working for him, serving him, loving him, prioritizing him, forsaking all others, being completely loyal and devoted to him. And no human being has done that. No human being has lived that out. Not the most pious, the most religious, the most devoted, the most loyal, the most good person has ever given the proper return for all it is that God has given us. We have contracted a debt to somebody who is infinitely deserving of our love and worship, and therefore it is a debt that we cannot repay. And so if he calls us before him in the state that we're naturally in, and he says, okay, time to pay up, what have you done for me? And you look at all of life stretching all the way back to infancy and see there's not enough there. There's not enough of a return. There's not enough worship. There's not enough obedience. There's not enough glory. There's a whole lot of you going this way, that way, the other way, giving other people credit for things that I deserve the credit for, giving yourself the credit for things that I deserve the credit for, doing your own thing. And so therefore, you're going to be sent to the jailers. You're going to be sent to the torturers until you pay back everything you owe me, and you never will. That's hell, right? And so, what God has done through Jesus Christ is he said, I have paid your debt myself. You don't have the assets to pay it, but I do. And my assets are my Son, who is exactly like me in every way, who is fully God, just as I am fully God, and we are one together with the Holy Spirit, who is also God, blessed forever. And I have given him to pay myself. I've given him to you for him to become human like you, and for him to absorb, to pay everything that you never paid by his perfect obedience to me, going to the ultimate extent of death on a cross. And that pays your debt. So now, the debt is paid. I have dealt with it within myself, within the Trinity, within the triune God, and so now you are forgiven. And forgiven is forgiven, right? Forgiven, again, is not, well, if you work a little bit harder at it to show me that you're serious, you're going to be kind of in the doghouse here with me for another 20, 30 years, but then if you stay there and eventually prove it to me, then okay, then you're forgiven. No, it's not that. It's a complete wiping it away. Complete wiping it away. Like from now on, from this point forward, you are clean. We are at zero. You don't have to continue to feel guilty about these things that you've done. You don't have to continue to feel guilty for offending me. I'm telling you, it is over. It is done. I have forgiven it. I have torn it up. It is gone, baby. It is gone. We are starting fresh, clean slate from now on. Okay? That's what God's forgiveness is, right? Now, if we want to continue to live in that forgiveness, which again, he goes first. It's not like I forgive you so that therefore then that will trigger God forgiving me. No, God goes first. God went first. God went first to forgive me. If I want to live in that forgiveness, if I want to maintain that, if I want to live and walk in that grace, I've got to extend that grace to somebody else. The person who does wrong to me. You know, this amount that was contracted by this second slave, 100 denarii, that's not a small amount of money. That's a significant amount of money. But it's nowhere near the amount of money that we've contracted with God. No matter how much somebody has offended you, no matter how badly somebody has done you wrong, and let me tell you something, there are people who have done really, really wrong things to you. I might not know it, but I know that it's true. I know that it's true. I mean, I've heard stories from people saying about what their parent did to them when they were a child. Things that are horrible, horrifying, that some of you or others have revealed to me, right? You know, or things that a spouse did, or things that somebody else did. I mean, I'm not trying to make light of these things. These are horrible, horrible, wicked, brutal things, and yet that is a very small thing. That, as huge as that is, it's a very small thing compared to the offense that we've done to God. Might be hard to believe, but that's what Jesus tells us, and he would know, being God himself. And so if I'm going to live in that forgiveness, if I'm going to continue to experience that forgiveness of being, scot-free, I've got to be willing to extend it to other people. I've got to be willing to forgive other people. Not because they deserve it, but because they don't deserve it. Because I don't deserve it either. Right? So the number one reason to forgive is to be forgiven, is to live in that forgiveness, because what Jesus says is, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to being unforgiven. I know how much I have to be forgiven for. That's not quite true. I don't know how much, but I have an idea. And I know I don't want to experience what this servant experiences here. So in that time that somebody has done me wrong, and it's obsessing me, and it's bothering me, and I'm just thinking of all the reasons that they did this wrong thing, and I've got my whole indictment just kind of laid out in my head, and I just can't let go of it. I can't stop thinking about it. The number one motivator for me to forgive is that I need to be forgiven. That's the number one motivator. I am afraid of what will happen if I don't forgive. That's the number one motivator. Why didn't this slave forgive? Why didn't he forgive his brother? Why didn't he forgive this other fellow slave of his? Well, let's look back at what he says here to the king. Verse 26. The servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. Remember, how much does he owe? 10,000 talents, right? Bajillion dollars, okay? What does he say to the king? Be patient with me, and I will pay back everything. His master, the king, forgives him. But does the slave ever figure out how unable he is to pay this back? I don't think he does. I don't think it ever really registers to this slave how hopeless his situation is. And I think that unforgiveness is most tempting to the Christian when the Christian does not really get how hopeless they are without the grace of God. When a Christian thinks that yes, God has forgiven me, but he forgave me because I got my life back together and came to him. Or he forgave me because I asked him for forgiveness and I'm trying really hard to do the right thing. Or he forgave me because, I didn't know what I was doing, and once I figured out how bad it was, then I came to him. Or he forgave me because in some other way, even though it was a debt that I contracted, even though there's sins that I committed, there's something about me that somehow deserves to be forgiven. People who think that if they just work a little harder, then eventually they'll get right with God, do not understand his grace. And people who do not understand his grace do not extend his grace to other people. People who think that maybe I can work a little bit harder to get in God's good graces do not get how big how his mercy is and how much they've been forgiven. And therefore, when somebody comes to them who has hurt them, they think you should be working a little harder. You should be trying a little more. You should have known better. One of the big enemies then to our extending grace by forgiving is not grasping how much we've been forgiven. Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever had that moment where you realized how helpless you were? Not everybody has. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The experience of knowing how desperate you are without God's grace, how hopeless and helpless you are before him, and how gross and disgusting your sinfulness is unless he washes it away, that is the worst thing I've ever experienced in my life. And I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, and yet I wish it for every single person that I know. Because until you've experienced that, you cannot know how amazing is his grace, and how sweet is that sound that saves a wretch like me. I mean, holy cow, man, when you realize how desperate your need is, then you realize how vast is the love and grace of God. I mean, it is just immeasurable. I mean, it is an ocean. It is so enormous that it just covers everything. As Paul says in Romans 5, where sin abounded, grace abounded all the more. And when you know that, then you say, yeah, I don't want ever to step outside of that grace. Yeah, I want to extend that grace to somebody who hurt me. Second reason to forgive is for ourselves not only to be forgiven, but to be free. To be free. We think often that the person who offended us, the person who harmed us, who hurt us, that we can't let go of that, because if we let go of that, then they will get away with something. We tend to think of it in terms of us holding on, and if we let go, then they are free. Free to hurt us again. Free to hurt somebody else again. Free to get away with it. Let me tell you something. When we let go of that resentment, we don't set them free, we set ourselves free. We set ourselves free when we let go of that resentment. You know, there's this old fable, I don't think it's true, but it should be because it's so good, that there was a group of sailors back in the old days of the great sailing ships exploring the seven seas, you know, and they landed on this island in the South Pacific, and they were, you know, setting up a trading post there. But the problem is that all their supplies were being stolen by the monkeys that were on this island. And they couldn't get these monkeys out of there because they were so sneaky. They would slip in through and they would grab the fruit and they would run away. And one ingenious sailor discovered that the way to capture the monkeys was to take fruit and to put it into a glass jar with a narrow opening, an opening just big enough for the fruit to get through. And the monkey would come and sneak in and would see that fruit and reach its paw into the jar and grab that fruit and try to pull it out of the jar, but couldn't pull it out. Because with his little monkey fist around this fruit, it was too fat to get through the bottleneck of this jar. And the jar was too heavy for him to move. And so the monkey would be trapped and would be able to be caught and killed by the sailors because he couldn't get free of the trap. But the only thing holding the monkey in the trap was the monkey. Resentment is like that. It grips us, so we grip it. And we can't let go. And when we don't let go, who's the one trapped? The other person? No, we're trapped. Another interesting analogy or turn of phrase for this, a phrase that I've heard, a slogan that I've heard, maybe you've heard it too, is resentment is the poison we drink hoping others will die. Resentment is the poison we drink hoping others will die. But it's not hurting them. It's hurting us. Ken Burns, one of his famous documentaries was called The War. It aired on PBS about 10 years ago. The War was the story of ordinary American enlisted men in World War II. There were a number of veterans who were interviewed through the course of this documentary series. One of them talked about, and they were very, very open. These were men who for many, many years didn't talk at all about their experiences in the war. But when they got into their 80s and 90s, they started to become willing to talk about it. One of these men served in the Pacific, and he came home from the Pacific with a deep and abiding and profound hatred for the Japanese people, for the things that he had witnessed, seen, suffered, and experienced fighting them in World War II. And he talked about how as he went through his life, as he went into adulthood, this was eating him up inside. This hatred, this anger, this vindictiveness, this being wronged was eating him up inside. And he went and he talked to his preacher. This is a southern man. He was from Mississippi, and he had this, deep southern drawl. He said he went and talked to his preacher. And the preacher, he said, helped me see that all of my anger wasn't doing anything to them over there. It wasn't doing anything to people in Japan. It wasn't making their lives any worse. It wasn't condemning them. It wasn't judging them. All it was doing was ruining me. And he realized he needed to forgive. He realized he needed to let it go. I don't know why this first slave went to the second slave and was convinced he needed that 100 denarii. I don't know why he thought he was so desperate to have it. I mean, after all, his master had just forgiven him, had just loaned him 10,000 talents, and then just forgave it. I mean, if he really needed the money, he could probably go back to the master and say, okay, can you loan me a few more bucks? I mean, can we, or you just give it to me? You already given me all the rest of this, right? But he felt for some reason he needed this from his fellow slave. And when somebody hurts us, they've taken from us something that we think we need. Or maybe what we need now is we need them to say they're sorry. We need them to apologize, or we need them to make it right. We need it, we need it, we need it. We need it for our ego, or we need our money back, or we need our dignity back, or we need something out of this, or we need them back in our lives. We need something, and we can be desperate. I need it back from you. But we don't, because whatever it is that we think that we need from them, God can supply. Whatever the enemy takes from us for evil, God can give it back to us for our good. And it's the knowledge of that reality that His grace is so great that enables us to be free of needing that thing back that was taken from us in some way, shape, or form by that other person. So how do we do it? How do we forgive? I'm going to let you learn that on your own. But there's an insert in your bulletin that I encourage you to read at home. It's called How to Release Resentments, and it's a process that I have used at times. I wish I never had to use it, but just like you, I do. And it's a process to walk through to practice forgiving somebody else. And I encourage you to try it. I can encourage you to follow it for somebody in your life that you struggle with forgiveness for. And if it's somebody that you already have forgiven, but you just have those ugly feelings coming back over and over again, maybe what you need to do in reading through this process is just a reminder to yourself that, yes, I have done this, and because I've done this, I'm going to stand on the fact that I've done this rather than standing on the fear that I haven't because of my ugly feelings. Because sometimes the ugly feelings come back, sometimes they linger, sometimes the devil tempts us with those. That doesn't necessarily mean that we haven't forgiven already. But if you haven't forgiven, if you have those things, if you know that there's a grudge that you're bearing, walk your way through these. I can tell you for myself that the key step, they're all key steps. Every single one of them is important. But I will tell you that for me, perhaps the most important is step number 3. Admit to God your inability to release the resentment on your own and humbly ask Him for help to set you free. The thing about resentment, the thing about offense, is that it can become all-consuming. And I find that it's not that I have the resentment, it's that the resentment has me. And I can't let it go. I can't get rid of it. I'm too weak. I'm powerless to forgive. I need the one who is able to forgive me to come in me and forgive through me. And I've found whenever I've asked Him to do that, and then I've done step 4, deliberately forgive the person you resent, saying, I don't feel like it. I have no evidence that I'm really forgiving. My heart and my spirit are still a mess, but I'm declaring right now in the name of Jesus, I forgive so-and-so. God has never failed to change my feelings after I've forgiven. Maybe not right that second, maybe the next day, maybe the next week, maybe the next year. But God has always done it. We think that we need to feel like forgiving and then we'll forgive. That's totally wrong. It never works that way. It's a lie from the devil. It goes the other way around. You forgive first and the feelings follow. Forgive first, the feelings will follow. Don't follow your heart, lead your heart. Your heart will follow your lead if you choose to forgive. Kelly's going to play a song right now, and this might be a really critical time for us to meditate